final probability increaser that we can use for supply and demand zones is the concept of mitigation. And what is mitigation? It's essentially price tapping into a supply or demand zone and seeing the series of that phenomena occurring. So what we know is we have a sweep of liquidity, a break of structure that improves the quality of a supply zone that we're seeing. Now, if we start to see price tapping into a supply zone, we would consider that a mitigation, and what we'd expect is price to then move to the downside. And what we can see in this example is we've swept liquidity, we're breaking structure, and more importantly, breaking the swing structure. We now have formed another supply zone, and then price can continue moving to the upside, tap into that or mitigate, and then price then moves to the downside. What we can see, break structure, take liquidity, mitigate. And this can happen multiple times, and this is another way that we can start to improve the probability of our trades. So in the previous videos, we said that improving the probability of the supply or demand zone, we'd be looking for a break of structure, a sweep of liquidity, and now we're going to add on the concept of mitigation, and it's a form of improving the supply and demand zones and the probability that they will actually see price respecting them. So what we can see, if we move back to our examples again, this one is a little bit less common compared to break of structure and sweep. So if we're looking at the combination of these probability increasers, we would have in order of succession that we would see. Number one would be a break of structure. More often than not, we're going to see a break of structure. Number two would be a sweep of liquidity. And then number three would be the mitigation. The mitigation is more of a read between the lines sort of phenomena that we could use, where we may only see a mitigation of a zone that creates a supply zone, and it may break structure, but that might be it. It might not break structure either, so we need to read between the lines a little bit. This is where things get a little bit convoluted, which is why it's a probability increaser, but I personally wouldn't just look at mitigations in isolation for validating a point of interest. So if we look on the 15-minute here in the examples that we've been going through, what we can see is that we do have what looks to be a demand zone. We break structure, so in theory this is valid. We break structure. So we can look at that, and what we can see is price does in fact tap into that. We have a mitigation of this demand zone because, again, we broke structure. And then when we were looking at this zone, we can see that we swept liquidity, and we broke structure. So this makes this zone even stronger based on that information. So if we just look again, what we can see is we do have a little bit of structure break. We create a demand zone, but it sweeps liquidity. We don't actually end up mitigating anything. So again, not much happens in the way of improving the odds using the concept of mitigation. Then what we can see is if we just move on, we get equal highs, we get a tap, we mitigate something because we've swept liquidity. We haven't actually broken structure. So again, this is where things get a little convoluted, but we can look at this in a different lens. So let me just zoom in to make this a little bit clearer. So what we can see is if we just look at this, we can see that we took out the external range liquidity of this high, and then we got our pullback. We can say that on a lower time frame, this would more than likely be a break of structure, so we can start to look at it in that lens. Where did we break structure, or where did that come from? More than likely this inside bar, which would be a demand zone. Now, I wouldn't recommend trading the reaction of this demand zone, but what we can see very easily is that price respects that, it mitigates that demand zone, and then that's where we get the sweep of liquidity, the break of structure, and we're able to use that as our demand zone. And then if we just continue moving on, we can just see that, again, we have a break of structure, very minor break of structure, again, on the lower time frame. We have demand zones that rest in wicks, and then price continues moving to the upside. We get a little bit more of a confirmed break of structure, sweep of liquidity. We have a little bit of a demand zone. We have a little bit more of a demand zone, some inducement, and then price does react off of it, but we don't see a follow through. Similar to this situation, we see that price hasn't actually mitigated anything in this area, but what we can see, if I just move this over, we can see that price mitigates a higher time frame point of interest. So I'll just move this back over one more time, move that right there, and what we can see is price takes liquidity and then moves to the downside. We could argue that on a 1 minute that this is structural break, so we do have a break of structure, but more importantly, we have a mitigation and a sweep of liquidity. And what we can see in this wick, we have a supply zone, we tap into that supply zone, and then we continue moving to the downside. If we look at this zone, we also, like we had mentioned in the previous videos, that we have this, which is just a pivot supply zone. You can see that we mitigated this. We created that pivot supply zone. We've mitigated that, so we're just adding in the concept of mitigation. But again, we know that this doji is a range on a lower time frame, therefore it's probably a higher probability. This mitigation is a lot more proper. This zone leaves a little bit to be desired, and as we can see, if we just move on, we get that slight tap. So more specifically, we probably did tap into something more so like that. As we can see, we do tap into it. So however you look at that supply and demand zone, the logic is still there. We've mitigated this wick, we've broken structure, and then we've mitigated this, which adds a mitigation to that. This is still a valid point of interest because we haven't actually tapped into it fully. We get a little bit, like I said, which is why price would gravitate a little bit higher in there. And then if we just use our bullish example again, sweep liquidity, break structure, mitigated this area right here. So what we can see is we've mitigated a demand zone to the left, this one right here. We've swept liquidity and broken structure, therefore it is a valid point of interest. What we can see is price never actually gets to that point of interest. We have this area right here, which just breaks structure. And then we continue moving on. So we're moving between this range. We haven't seen any mitigations that are warranting anything. Price then continues. We tap into all of these zones. And then we can just move into this little bit of information. You can see sweep of liquidity. We do have this particular zone, but nothing taps into that. We can start to see break of structure. So we can see valid point of interest that we could look at. Mitigation, which would bring us to here. We break structure right here, we break structure right here. Therefore, this would be a valid supply zone. Then we can see that we break structure here, and this point does in theory mitigate this, but we don't actually break structure. So again, if we're looking at this little bit, so we'll just go back. So we broke this structure, therefore it validates this POI as a supply zone on a lower time frame. We get that mitigation, and then price continues moving to the downside. What we can see is we do move to the downside, but we don't actually break any true structure. We sweep liquidity, so let's just move that. We sweep liquidity, and we've mitigated something. And then what we can see is price mitigates this wick. We break structure, and then we create a supply zone. So we have sweep of liquidity, we have a mitigation, we have a sweep of liquidity, we have a mitigation of this, and then we have a break of structure. Therefore, this is a fairly high probability zone, but what we can see is then we move to the upside. We tap into more of this area before we continue running to the downside. But again, we're just trying to understand what's happening here to put ourselves in the best position. We could have taken a trade here, and there's nothing wrong with that, because how would we have known that price was going to come up higher and interact with whatever is resting just above? Because we wouldn't actually know that price is going to move or pop up to the upside. The only indication that we could have is when we look at the concept of internal range liquidity once more. We know that we have a lot of swing points in structure. What does this end up creating? Creates a lot of liquidity that's resting there. We have that liquidity void, so we know that chances are price is probably going to fill that to a certain regard. So we're able to look and say that all of this has been mitigated, so chances are something up in here would make sense. Again, I would be more poised to look at this wick, which we never actually tap into. So that would be a missed opportunity, more than likely on my side. But again, this is where we start to look at the 1 minute, and we can start to see price reacting off of these areas, see if there is something that would rest within here to look for entries. It's getting a little bit more involved or a little bit more in depth than what I want to do in this video. But again, it's just explaining that we would not have really known that this was going to pop to the upside. The only way we would be able to really figure that out or have an indication that it could happen was, one, that we have all of this structural liquidity right here, and the fact that we haven't actually tapped into this supply zone as well. And we're starting to create relatively equal highs, structural highs that then we see getting swept right here. And now what we'll do is we'll just go back down to our 1 minute example that we've been going on in the last two videos. I'm trying to showcase the same examples just to show how we can add on these probability increasers to just understand what we're seeing on the charts, and that way we can make sense of everything that we're seeing. So now if we look at that first trade again, we have that sweep of liquidity, the break of structure, and what we can see is the first supply zone doesn't really get interacted with. As we can see, price then moves to the downside. We take liquidity, we create a supply zone, we break structure, and we take liquidity, which is why this is a valid supply zone. And what we can see is this supply zone right here is valid because we take liquidity, we break structure, and we mitigate a previous supply zone. Then we move on to this supply zone, which we can say we did sweep a little bit of liquidity, but it's definitely not as proper. We did sweep some liquidity here, so the option is there for you. It's not as clean, but what we can see is, what do? We break structure and we mitigate this supply zone. Therefore, a valid supply zone that increases probability because we have that break of structure and we have that mitigation of a previous supply zone. Now again, if we look at this, we have a break of swing structure. We have this inside bar, we have inducement, price taps into it and runs. And what we can see with this one is we take liquidity, we've mitigated this and we've broken structure. Therefore, this should be a valid point of interest. It holds and then we continue moving to the downside. And what I can do is I'll just drag this over, although we know that it was more or less we'd be interacting off of this zone. But what we can see with this supply zone as well, we get that change of character, that sweep of liquidity. Again, minor break of structure. So whether you're going to classify that, but again, this is why we're explaining this bit on why this is still a valid area that you can choose to trade. Why? Because we swept liquidity. We did break some structure. Again, arguably, if we broke structure, yes, on the seconds time frame, 1 minute, not so much. But more importantly, what did we also do? We mitigated a previous supply zone. So we have extra factors in our favor to look for a potential trade. We also have that level of inducement to look for an entry. It improves our overall probability of that supply zone trade playing out. Again, when we look at this one, this gives us more confidence to take this particular zone. Why? Because we broke structure, we took liquidity, and we mitigated a previous supply zone. Therefore, this looks to be a great point of interest or supply zone to look to trade. We move on to the next one. We take liquidity, we mitigate a previous supply zone, we break structure, we break structure, we break structure. Very great looking supply zone to look for future trades to be taken. Move on to this one. This one does not mitigate anything. We just sweep liquidity, tap in. What we can see at this one, we don't take liquidity, nor do we really break structure. Therefore, this point of interest that would be created more or less from this doji, not the highest probability. Why? Because we're not seeing any true commitment. We're not seeing a sweep of liquidity. We're not seeing a real break of structure that's created from this. Yes, we do have a small break of structure here. We create another break structure. It would push us to look here. Have we mitigated anything from here? Arguably, no. Yes, we have this, which is our pivot supply. We did break structure, but again, we're starting to look at small little details, but we're trying to look at the overall swing structure. And again, this is where it comes back to critical thinking. What is this? This ends up being internal range liquidity. We have a point of interest that rests above it that has all the confluences that we need. Break structure, break structure, break structure. Mitigate something to the left and sweeps liquidity. Now we're just trying to wait for price. Now we're just being patient and waiting for price to return back to that. And now we're starting to understand liquidity that is being dropped for the purpose of inducing to tap into that particular zone. And then what we can see if we just move on to the demand zone side of things, now that we know that price does in fact react off of this, we have sweep of liquidity, break of structure that changes trend. We're reacting off of a higher time frame demand zone. We tap into this, great. Now that we have our mitigation, we sweep liquidity, we break structure. This area right here has all the probability that we need, that chances are this will be a valid trade. And what we can see is price does eventually react and respect that zone. Now, if we look at this bit of price action, what we can see again, just a break of structure, a little bit of a sweep of liquidity, but the sweep of liquidity in my mind is a little bit convoluted because it's a little bit different on how this demand zone came to fruition. So not so much of a great or valid point for me to look at. What we can see here again, break of structure, sweep of liquidity, we create this POI. Now we have this point of interest that breaks structure, sweeps a little bit of liquidity. We have a mitigation. We have a mitigation of that zone, but ultimately this does not hold. Why? Because we're creating internal range liquidity. So we'd be starting to look for different points on a lower basis to look for entries, but there'd be nothing wrong with looking for an entry here and looking for an entry on this wick. If you were looking for something on this, then that's when we have to start running through our probability increasers. Yes, it does break structure. Does it mitigate anything? No. Does it sweep liquidity? No. That's why this area does seem a little bit more high probability. We sweep liquidity, we break structure, we mitigate a previous demand zone. And that's why, if we just zoom in and look to the right of this wick, that's why we do get a small reaction, but then eventual fail in price action. And now we can move on to this supply zone. Again, sweep of liquidity, break of structure, valid supply zone. We also have a mitigation of a previous supply zone, therefore higher probability supply zone being formed. And then we move on to this one. Again, we said we don't really have a sweep of liquidity. We really just have a break of structure, and we have inducement below. This one, we have sweep of liquidity, break of structure, mitigation of a previous demand zone, which is why this wick is a very valid demand zone to look for buys. And then one other thing that we'll just go over is a little bit more recent price action right here. And what we can see is when we're looking at a change of character, we're tapping into a higher time frame demand zone. So we know that the likelihood of price potential